Good afternoon. My name is Lori March. This presentation is on the timeline of extracurricular activities. The reason I chose extracurricular activities as my historic timeline is because for many reasons. The first being that this is the area that I currently work in and I have worked in for the past 14 years. But the main reason of this is my co-curricular involvement as an undergraduate student. I was given the opportunity to attend college like my other 6 siblings. But I was not the star student in K through 12. But in college, I found my niche. I found a major that I really and truly had some interest in. I also went on from there to join a sorority. And from there, the doors opened for me in co-curricular activities. I became a student ambassador. I was also a peer advisor. I joined the Public Relations Student Society of America. And I was involved in intramural sports. And I thrived in my Greek life involvement. The belief of my family and myself is that if it would not have been for these co-curricular activities, I may have never been retained through graduation. Now that you can see why I'm so passionate about co-curricular activities, we'll now investigate how they became to be a thriving part of our college and university down through the years. We're going to go ahead and start off with the beginnings of extracurricular activities in colleges and universities. According to Thielen, in 1636 was the founding of the first United States college. Back then, it was founded as the New College, but is known as Harvard University. With the founding of the first college in the United States came our first extracurricular activities. It was in the 19th century that the early extracurricular activities were literary societies, which had roots previously in centuries at Harvard and Yale. We had debate clubs, and by mid-century, Greek letter fraternities and sororities. Students also initiated and organized the early athletic programs on American college campuses. Literary societies were on the decline by the turn of the 20th century, and some educators felt that less desirable extracurricular activities were now distracting students from their curricular responsibilities. Intercollegiate athletics soon became a dominant element in the extracurriculum at most American colleges. Activities that often involve time commitment outside of the regular school day, such as band and choir, are also considered extracurricular activities. Thielen also noted that in the 1800s, activities would surface informally and even spontaneously among undergraduate students. If an activity enjoyed sustainability and popularity, it attracted scrutiny from the administration, and then attempts were made to abolish or control that activity. During that time, students also formed eating clubs in which they would pool resources to hire a cook or possibly rent a dining area. And in future years, this could have been looked at as somewhat prestigious. But then it was still a way of life. It was the forming of these groups that led to our prestigious universities such as Yale and Princeton, then diffusing into other colleges and led to the explosion of student organizations as literary societies, debating clubs, discussion groups, Greek letter fraternities, campus publications, athletics, libraries and reading collections, secret societies, honor groups, and even religion groups. Thielen also noted that if the undergraduates found the curriculum to be smothering, then they had reasonable odds to initiate interest outside of the classroom and formal studies. In the first half of the 19th century, student life was limited to terms of facilities and resources. Most colleges during that era tried to promote cohesiveness through membership in designated academic classes, such as the forming of the freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior classes. This then subdivided students into further groups and classes. Then there came the insiders, who dominated the prestigious groups, and the outsiders, who were typically lower in wealth class and were not offered the opportunities of insiders. This would many times cause them to develop their own social groups on campuses. According to Thielen and Hershey, in the later half of the 19th century, American undergraduates had created an elaborate, intricate world of student organizations, complex with codes of customs, values, rewards, and penalties. Undergraduates were not always pressing for fewer obligations. They expanded their freedom. Indeed, abundant evidence were suggested that students took the initiative to enhance the intellectual and creative content of the college experience. The rise of literary societies and debating clubs showed a dominant form of student enterprises in the late 18th century and early in the 19th century. Grassroots initiatives by undergraduates, often opposed by the faculty and administration, included the creation of libraries, the formation of discussion groups about policies, the study of modern languages, and reading of contemporary fiction. Only after going back and forth did college officials eventually allow student activities to exist on college campuses. In many cases, the administration legitimized the activities by making them a formal part of the college offerings. Phelan also noted that in the early 1900s is when student unions were introduced to the college campuses. This was the first attempt to identify that campuses were not just residential and to allow a place for commuter students to have a home away from home. This was also a way to break up the eating clubs and secret societies on campus. The development of literary societies into student governments. Student governments were also developed early in the extracurricular activities timeline. May noted that officials at the University of Georgia did not consider students during the late 1700s and early 1800s as inherent rights or privileges and felt that students had no rights and no need to be respected. In fact, they were not important enough to have rights. These frustrations revealed themselves to have student revolts during the late 1700s and early 1800s when students attacked instructors, burned buildings, and also protested their treatment of their classes. These young people sought ways to express themselves, to find something to fill their time, and to empower themselves to become engaged in their campus environment. The remedy for the frustrations pertained to narrow curriculum, limited instructional methodology, lack of institutional resources, and no extracurricular activities were established in the first model of student self-governance, which is known as literary societies. These literary societies were established to channel institutional frustrations. Many authors argue that they were the first to start in Harvard in the early 1700s, while other authors contended that the first literary societies formed at Yale in the mid-1700s. During the 1700s and 1800s, colleges did not possess the resources or personnel or finances for programs to provide the needs of the student population. May also noted that literary societies established students to become engaged educationally and socially on their campuses. These societies had significant and lasting influences on universities by opening institutions' first libraries, initiating an honor system, and providing a voice for the students. May also noted that literary societies were integral to higher education in the United States because they fulfilled a vacuum left by the inadequate resources of the college while satisfying the needs of the students. Literary societies were established by students, so students empowered themselves to take ownership of their college lives. In many cases, institutions recognized the effort of students and relinquished, to varying degrees, authority and responsibility to the students for self-government issues. Literary societies were self-regulated entities, allowing for the first steps towards self-governance. Literary societies were also the focal point for co-curricular resources and extracurricular activities for 100 years. However, as higher education evolved and became more complex, diverse, and established, literary societies outlived their usefulness, and literary societies began to decline in the 1830s as institution offerings expanded and the number of typical social outlets increased. Those increases included athletics, fraternities, clubs, and special organizations. Administration regulations and policies became more liberal and lenient. The literary societies lost influence and eventually died out as these improvements did away with many of the principal grounds for their establishment. According to May, during the mid-1800s, student-led honor systems became formalized through writing honor codes and establishing honor councils and tribunes. Often, the honor councils emerged from the actions of early literary societies. It was thought of self-regulated honor systems, and students were able to take control of their institution's judicial and disciplinary processes. Over time, students were successful in their efforts to create codes of behaviors to hold themselves accountable for those standards. Institutions then withdrew their objection and allowed students to oversee their own lives. Throughout the 1800s, the roles and influence of honor councils and honor systems grew. By the 1900s, honor systems had become an integral part of student self-governance and had continued to evolve and adapt to the ever-changing higher education environment ever since. By the early 1900s, the governing structure of the student population evolved as higher education institutions were growing in size and complexity. Campuses no longer comprised small, intimate numbers of homogeneous students. Campus populations were growing more diversified by gender and socioeconomic status. In addition, students were no longer required to study a fixed class curriculum. Instead, they were able to study a number of subjects and professional fields, as well as participate in a multitude of co-curricular and extracurricular activities. Instructions began to subdivide or categorize students by their class rank, which we discussed earlier, then that level of academic proficiency. Students also began to associate themselves by class status as a means of categorizing themselves. Student self-governance then evolved from a mass assembly of a more representative form of governance, and it became the class council. May also noted that with larger and more diverse campuses, students sought ways to label or classify each other. With larger student populations, it was no longer easy to know everyone on campus, so students no longer became familiar or developed close associations with peers with whom they enrolled. Students became organized by their class associations, and as a result, class councils were established in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Each class created a class council wherein they elected officers to represent their needs and serve as activity scheduling agents. The class officers governed their respective classes by monitoring their fellow students and handling the honor and disciplinary infractions, as well as making recommendations to requests to their institutional administration. However, the reign of class councils was short-lived. It was from about 1875 to 1925. The evolution of higher education, as well as the growing number of diverse students enrolling in a college campus, led to a significant change in both the academic and extracurricular lives of students, including the decline and influence of growth of class councils. With the growth of extracurricular activities, students were less class status and more likely to identify themselves by their clubs, their Greek affiliations, team memberships, or residential status. Even